My Emil invited me to a luxury restaurant. The chef pulled me aside and whispered, "Run, now." She said it like someone trying not to be heard over clinking glasses and the murmur of lunch. Short, flat, impossible to mishear. I remember the way she leaned in, the heat of the kitchen at her back, apron still tied, a smear of sauce on one sleeve that somehow made the moment feel more urgent than theatrical. I remember the word run, and then the taxi, and the shaking that started behind my ribs and didn't stop for hours. You're probably wondering how a celebratory lunch turned into something like that. I was too, until it wasn't any longer a mystery, and everything became evidence. My name is Emily Thompson. I was 31 when this happened. I worked in advertising, which, if you've ever done it, means you can make a tight deadline look like bravery and call a late-night brainstorm fun. I'm married to John. He's warm and steady in a way that made the small, private cruelties around him feel impossible to fit into the life we were building. His mother, my mother-in-law, was outwardly the kind of woman who brought flowers to new neighbors and remembered birthdays with perfect calligraphy. She had built a kind of social currency on being the generous, involved matriarch. I have a severe allergy to several fruits in the Rosacea family. That's peaches, plums, cherries, some apples, and pears, things that used to be simple pleasures in my life. I didn't grow up allergic. The reaction started when I was in my mid-20s. The first time I had a serious reaction, it felt like betrayal. I'd eaten a slice of peach at a summer party, and within minutes my throat tightened and my face flushed. The ER did the usual tests. The doctors were precise, the paperwork blunt, an allergy that needed to be treated seriously. After that, routines changed. I carried an EpiPen. I wore a small medical badge tucked inside my purse. I learned how to read menus like someone reading blueprints. Those adaptations cleaned some things up and revealed others. People who loved me adjusted. People who didn't understand grew impatient. But my mother-in-law? At first, she was the kind of ally you could relax around. She learned to ask questions. She learned the restaurants and the dishes that were safe and the things to avoid. She bragged to other people that she'd learned how to cook desserts without peaches so everyone could eat at her house. Those dinners were where she did a lot of her quiet campaigning for affection from the family. She built influence through hospitality. That made it sternly believable when, a few weeks after I got promoted to senior copywriter, she called and said she'd arranged a celebration at this one restaurant I'd always wanted to try, a hotel restaurant with exacting reviews and a chef who'd been on the cover of magazines. "I have a connection," she said. "It'll be perfect." I hesitated. A restaurant named for its tasting menu is not a place you stroll in sans communication with your medical needs. But she sounded so pleased with herself. She sent me a text about the dress code and told me she'd take care of the booking. She said she'd already spoken with the concierge. Her voice had grown into the same kind of soft insistence that marked many of her gifts, the feeling that refusing would be ungrateful. So I said yes. On the day, I wore a dress that felt like a quiet wish. We met in the hotel lobby. The restaurant had that slow, filtered light that makes everyone look a little more composed than they feel. We ordered champagne. My chest had that light, celebratory flutter you get when work and life align. We posed for a photo at the table. I could feel the relief of being celebrated. I could feel the small pressure to be gracious. There was a call from the office, a client with a last-minute issue. I stepped out to take it, thinking it would be 2 minutes. I leaned against the side door of the restaurant, the noise dimming behind it. That's when Kate came up to me. Kate Young, the chef who grabbed my arm and pulled me aside. She used to be married to my mother-in-law, a fact that made the story that followed lean into a kind of private irony I couldn't have written. Kate had a history with the family I'd been told. But on that afternoon she was entirely focused on the task at hand, keeping me from eating food I couldn't survive. She looked at my medical badge, the tiny symbol I used to mark the lives affected by my allergy. She touched my wrist where my EpiPen sat in its case in my purse. She didn't smile. "There are things on the menu you can't see," she said. "And the reservation didn't say anything about an allergy. You need to leave. Run. Now." 3 words. Run. Now. I didn't ask for clarification. I didn't think about etiquette. I thought about my throat and the last time I'd rattled in an ambulance. I thought about the tiny, invisible ways a sauce could be sweetened or a garnish could be dusted with a fruit powder. Kate explained, but she didn't over-explain. She said the kitchen had prepared unexpected elements for the tasting menu, and that several plates included reductions or coulis made with fruits from my allergy family. She said those ingredients could be hidden in glazes and creams that tasted neutral until they weren't. She told me the reservation notes showed no mention of an allergy, and when she'd asked the front desk, they'd confirmed that no one had told them about food restrictions. Her voice was steady. Her hands were steady. I remember the smear of sauce on her sleeve, as though life can give you theater and terror at once. I walked back into the lobby with a smile on my face, which in hindsight looked like the last ghost of civility. I told my mother-in-law I needed to leave because of work. She looked surprised, annoyed even. I told her I'd feel faint about the menu and that I'd rather not risk it. She said, with that same thin generosity she'd always practiced, that I was being dramatic, that she had it handled. I put my phone between us and the tiled floor and called a taxi. On the walk out, my phone buzzed. It was my mother. "Are you okay?" she asked. "John said there was some mix-up." I pressed the speaker to my ear as the taxi idled, and I could hear the restaurant clink behind me. The moment doubled. The ordinary, rain on a taxi window, a seatbelt that clicked, and the extraordinary. A woman in a uniform telling me to run. After I'd gotten into the cab and the driver pulled away, my mother-in-law called. I switched the call to speaker and started recording. I didn't do it because I was plotting anything. I did it because my hands were trembling, and recording felt like taking a breath. The call went sideways fast. At first she was calm, then impatient, then furious about my rudeness, leaving without saying goodbye in front of her guests, making her look bad. I tried to explain that Kate had warned me, and that the reservation hadn't noted my allergy. She laughed, a small thing that cut. She said she had made the arrangements. She had told them about everything. When I asked for clarification, did she tell the restaurant about my allergy? Her tone shifted. The thing I remember most wasn't a neat confession, like a crime in a movie. It was a kind of unguarded cruelty that revealed motive without naming it. She said she'd always felt like I'd pushed into her life. She said she'd been jealous. She said, without apology, that she had wanted me to understand the cost of what I'd taken: attention, status, a place in the family. She didn't say the words, "I wanted you to die." She didn't have to. She said she didn't care if I was made uncomfortable. She said she'd been tired of my successes. The way she spoke left little doubt about whether she understood what could happen when an allergy was ignored. When John heard the recording later, he heard the same things I did. He heard her listless cruelty, the small justifications, the absence of the tiny protections that would have kept me safe. He listened to the part where she called my departure dramatic, and then the part where the anger bled into something more dangerous. He cried. He swore. He called his father. He left our apartment and went to confront her. He didn't call the police. He didn't strike any melodramatic posture. He picked up his keys and walked out of our life as it was that day, the soundtrack of shoes on pavement, and the hum of his breath colliding with the click of the front door being closed behind him. I suppose people imagine moments like that are cinematic in the wrong ways. Chiefs of police, dramatic arrests, immediate criminal records. Real life is messier. What happened next was a collection of human reactions. My parents demanded to see the recording. They held their faces in their hands and said words like "attempted murder" until the room spun. John's father, who had the kind of voice that made people feel both judged and loved, told his wife, my mother-in-law, that if she had anything to say, she would say it in front of the family. The family fractured. The matriarch found herself offered fewer invitations, fewer phone calls, fewer excuses. The restaurant, when I spoke to Kate later, confirmed there had been no allergy noted on their reservation. They were careful in how they said it, polite, measured, but the implication was there. Kate herself had put her foot down that day in the kitchen because she recognized the badge, and because she had history with my mother-in-law that made her unwilling to gamble. Kate had been treated poorly by my mother-in-law in the past. The story of that treatment was something I would learn in the weeks that followed, little by little. But in the moment, all that mattered was the warning and the way she'd looked at me as if she'd seen a long-ago version of herself and decided better. That night, John came over holding 2 paper cups of coffee. He didn't speak at first. He sat across from me on the couch and played the recording. He listened with a thunderous focus, eyes narrowing, breath catching. When it ended, he put the cups down like they had weight. I'd never seen him look so angular with anger. He went to his mother's house and didn't come back for days. When the family gathered to talk, my parents, who are practical in ways that make lawyers nervous, said they were considering legal options. They said they'd talk to lawyers about negligence. It was not the kind of thing I asked for. It was the kind of thing my parents reached for when they felt the world had tilted under their child. I told them not to do anything reckless. I stayed factual. The recording existed. The chef's testimony existed. John had cut ties. That was enough to make the social consequences enmesh themselves in the family. My mother-in-law, who had been the center of so many social arrangements, found herself untethered. Invitations dwindled. Old friends offered the kind of cautionary distance that feels like a slow unthreading of a life. She was asked, by relatives, to find another place to live for a while. The polite euphemisms of family etiquette feel cruel when they're suddenly applied to you. She did not, to my knowledge, face any criminal charges. I won't speak for the legal system. My whole goal with the recording was to make sure there was a factual account of what had been said. The rest has to be handled by the systems that handle these things. And Kate? She became, in a way I had not expected, a friend. After that afternoon, she sent me a text asking if I was all right. I went to the restaurant not to eat, but to speak to her properly, to thank her, and to understand how she had known. We sat in a quiet corner while the kitchen clanged miles away. She told me, simply, that she recognized the badge and that she'd worked too hard to lose people because of assumed civility. She'd been on the other end of my mother-in-law's dismissal once upon a time. She'd been the one who baked for parties and then watched the praise go to someone else. She had scars, not just of arguments, but of smaller betrayals that settle into a person. When she told me that, I realized the scene had a symmetry. We were both people who'd been minimized by someone who wanted the appearance of control. We met again. We talked. We laughed about absurd things. Kate introduced me to a version of the restaurant that had nothing to do with gossip and everything to do with craft. She taught me to recognize when a glaze was likely to contain fruit reductions and what sorts of questions were reasonable to ask a sommelier without sounding like a germaphobe. She understood what it was to carry a hazard and still want to live fully. Her friendship felt like an unexpected repair. Someone who had been pushed down by the same hand that had tried to orchestrate my potential harm was now opposite me, steady. There was a party later, thrown by John and his father, a small thing with candles and too many balloons, a way of saying we were still a family in some sense. The father-in-law stood beside me across the room at one point and raised his glass to me in a toast that felt like a small covenant. John stayed close. The wound between him and his mother did not knit overnight. He made it clear where he stood. He told her, with a kind of grief in his voice that I still cannot forget, that he could not be close to someone who would risk his wife's life. That was his decision to make. I cannot claim it for him. After the confrontation, after the phone calls and the quiet withdrawals, life moved forward. It does, in ways that can be both comforting and disorienting. I found myself being more vigilant, not because I wanted to be fearful, but because survival often requires attention. I also found myself less willing to perform gratitude to people who had not earned it. The social ledger had changed. People asked why I went to the restaurant at all. That question sat like an uncomfortable stitch in the story. On the surface, it was naive. I trusted my mother-in-law because she'd earned that trust in small domestic ways. That trust had been a currency. It was also true that not going would have looked ungracious and would have been yet another small way of setting myself apart in a family that prized togetherness. Who doesn't choose connection, especially on a day when they've been promoted and want the people around them to be happy? I never felt like the victim in headlines. This story was personal, messy, and at times humiliating. But I was also, in a way, lucky. Kate saw what I couldn't. The recording captured what my mother-in-law said. The people I loved moved quickly to protect me. Those are small mercies, but they stack into something meaningful. There's a temptation, when a betrayal is exposed, to tell you everything you wish to know about the other person, to paint them in black and white. I won't do that. My mother-in-law is a complicated woman. There are memories of early kindness, of sick days sat beside me when I was ill, of meals that tasted like home. I cannot, in good conscience, erase all of that. But calling something what it is matters. When someone who knew the danger of my allergy refrained from protecting me, whether out of jealousy or indifference or a desire for control, that was a choice with consequences. In the months that followed, people took sides and some relationships loosened. The social world that my mother-in-law had curated shrank. She had to reassess who she was when the rituals that gave her influence were stripped away. I have mixed feelings about what that loss did to her and what it did to our family. Grief and relief lived in the same house for a while. John lost his mother in the way that people sometimes lose roots, slowly, with shock waves that knocked over small things in his daily life. He grieved the idea of her even as he stood with the truth of what she had done. I kept the recording, not because I wanted to hurt her, but because facts have a solidity that memory sometimes lacks. It is easier to tell a story when you can point to the thing that was said and hear it with your own ears. The recording set boundaries. It allowed conversations to be anchored in reality instead of rumor. There are things you learn when a family shifts like this. One is that kindness and cruelty can wear the same face. Another is that help can come from surprising places. People you once thought were enemies can become your most steadfast allies. That is, perhaps, the smallest miracle in all of this. Friendship born from the same wound that produced so much chaos. If you've ever had a dietary scare or been betrayed by someone you trusted, I'd love to hear about it. Leave a comment below. It helps to know we're not alone. When I think back to that afternoon, the memory that first comes is Kate's breath, the way she leaned in and said the words that made me move. That whisper, "Run, now," became, in retrospect, the hinge of everything. It split my life into before and after. Before, when trust had a simpler equation. After, when trust required proof. We celebrated my promotion in quieter, more intentional ways after that. There were dinners that took place in kitchens, where I knew every ingredient, or in restaurants where the reservation explicitly listed my allergy. There were bouquets sent by friends who had seen the whole thing unfold. There was a cake made by Kate's sister, simple, fruit-free, lovingly iced. We stood in the living room and clinked cups. I wore a dress that felt like a smaller wish this time, less about being seen and more about being safe. The mother-in-law's life did not implode into ruin. That is not what happened. She lost influence. She lost invitations. She had to reckon with a new solitude that she had, in part, made for herself. She reached out at one point with a letter full of apologies and rationalizations that read like a meditation on how people justify themselves when the mirror is too bright. John read it and folded it up and left it on a counter. His father told him to take his time. I have thought a lot about what justice looks like in situations like this. Sometimes justice is a legal matter, and sometimes it is the quieter work of rearranging your life so that the people who protect you are the ones closest to you. For me, justice felt like truth being witnessed and my sense of safety being returned. It felt like Kate sitting beside me in a quieter corner of the restaurant months later, and us sharing a plate of dessert that had not been compromised by hidden fruit. It felt like John choosing me first, and his father raising his glass on my behalf. It felt like my parents holding me and saying over and over that they would not let me be alone in this. I don't tell this story for spectacle. I tell it because the shape of family can change suddenly, and because there are small signals in ordinary places that, if listened to, will save you. I tell it because a chef in an apron saving my life is a kind of truth we should honor. People who work in the world of food know its hidden edges better than most. I tell it because if my experience helps one person ask one more question at a table or insist a reservation note gets recorded, then the moment I ran will have been worth it. To anyone watching who carries an allergy or who has ever found themselves trusting someone who later proved unreliable, be careful, be brave in the ways you can be, and hold on to the people who act on your behalf when it matters most. If this story resonated with you, consider liking and sharing. If you want to hear more true personal dramas, subscribe. There are more stories to tell, and I promise to keep telling them honestly. Above all, remember the 3 words that saved me. Run, now.